Bill was a man of many facets. As I mentioned, we probably remember him most for his academic achievements. The man was a giant, an absolute giant across disciplines. He had more than 500 books and articles that he published. Tremendous impact on business, on government, on students, on universities. One of his articles published in 1978 was the defining article for a technique called DEA, Data and Development Analysis. That particular article alone has been cited 13,000 times. 13,000 times, one article. Now put that in context. The typical professor over his or her career will have about 130 citations. I was talking to Bill, and a doctoral student walks into his office, and the student very carefully hands Bill the draft of his dissertation. And Bill thanks him and said, "Thank you very much," puts it on his desk and says, "Come back in a week and I'll give you some comments." A week goes by, the student comes back. Bill hands the draft back to him and says, "You can do better than this. I know you can." The student takes the dissertation and leaves. Comes back a week later. Bill says, "I'll look at it, but you can probably do better than this." The student comes back the third time. He's got tears in his eyes. He said, "Professor Cooper, I've worked on this thing day and night. I've done everything to it, and I can't do any better." Bill said, "Good, now I'll read it." As you probably know, Bill dropped out of high school when he was a sophomore to help his family since he was the oldest child in the family. He never graduated from high school. He never graduated from high school. Subsequently, he got his GED. To help the family, he set bowling pins, delivered ice, caddied on the golf course, and he was a prize fighter, first at 118 pounds, later at 136 pounds. His fights were typically 3 rounds in length. He fought under different names, so his mother wouldn't know that he was fighting. His favorite name was Billy Williams. Maybe Leon or Emily have some insights into that. Billy Williams was his favorite ring name when he was fighting. He had 53 fights. He won 49. He had one draw, and he lost 3. The last fight he had, he lost, and he was knocked out. That's when he decided to go to college. I don't know if all of you know that Bill was a jokester, especially in later life. He had a true repertoire of jokes, but it was a small repertoire. So we would hear the same jokes over and over. These are Bill's jokes, they're not mine, so you can have a courtesy laugh anyway. One of his other favorite jokes was that the minister, the priest, and the rabbi were out in a boat in the middle of the lake. And they're just sitting there looking around. And all of a sudden, the priest gets out of the boat in the water and walks around the boat and gets back in. Next, the minister gets out of the boat, walks on the water around the boat, and gets back in. The rabbi thinks, well, I can do that. The rabbi gets out of the boat, boom, to the bottom of the lake. He comes up sputtering and said, "What is this? You 2 guys walked on the water. Why can't I?" So the priest looked at the minister and said, "Should we tell him where the rocks are?" Those are Bill's jokes, not mine. Interestingly enough, Bill had a little book that he carried with him at all times that had these jokes in them. I never saw the book. I didn't know it existed until he passed away, and it was in his pocket in the hospital. He never went anyplace without his book of jokes.
There was discussion at his birth by our family, not involving me, of course, Our dad's name was William Wager Cooper, Wager being a family name over many years. And our mother pondered long, and she decided wisely, as she always did, he would not be called Junior. She was right. There was nobody I could think of who was least likely to be called Junior all his life. He was called Wager. In fact, he and I caddied together at the local golf courses in Chicago. I was called Young Wager. As kids growing up, my brother being 5 years my senior, we were inseparable. Everywhere he went, I went, and everything he did, I did, not as well, of course. He was a tough kid. Growing up in Chicago, in that jungle where we lived, where we grew up, key to survival was having good street fighter tricks and tactics. Bill was a master at it. And he taught me all the tricks that he could, so I wasn't so bad either. That was the only way you could survive in those days. Our dad, William Wager Cooper, a wonderful guy, successful, very, very prosperous businessman, but owing to a series of reverses, bad luck and everything that goes along with it, and of course, where else would this happen? In the depths of his depression, he lost everything. And as Bob mentioned, Bill, recognizing that the only thing to do was to drop out of high school and become the breadwinner. And as Bob said, he was a prize fighter. That's where he made most of his money. But he was a pen setter in bowling alleys, did lots of other things, anything to make a buck. And I remember very well, on some days, he didn't bring any money home, and we went out food for a day or two. Pretty hard to believe, isn't it? That accounts for my small stature. He always ate more than I did. Bob talked about Bill's adventures on the golf course. As I mentioned, he and I caddied together, and we're both pretty good caddies, but unfortunately, he decided to beat the hell out of all the other caddies on the golf course. That wasn't so bad, except they call a member a dirty name. And he got bounced off the golf course. So he went caddying at another golf course, and as indeed great luck would have it, hitchhiking, he met a remarkable guy, Carrick Kohler, whom I knew very well. At that time, a professor of accounting and manager of Arthur Anderson and Company, at that time, a respectable organization compared with what they became later, a big, bloated, and corrupt one. Knowing Kohler as I do, he would not have tolerated anything like that. He would have cleaned house. But Kohler took a shine to this tough-looking kid, and Wager or Bill had a photographic memory, among his other talents, and he began to recite page after page of Freud's introductory lectures on psychoanalysis. Kohler told me laughingly some years later, he said he knew every word, but he didn't understand a single one. But Kohler was amazed at the talents of this guy. So he said, after querying his educational background, he decided the best thing to do was to have him apply for entrance examination at the University of Chicago. In those days, Robert Hutchins was the chancellor, and his decision was to allow anybody, no matter who could pass the entrance examination, would be admitted as a student, as an undergraduate. And indeed, that's what happened. But Wager, that's what I lapsed into it, lacked good study habits. So Kohler took him in hand and showed him all of the tricks of the game. And Bill, at that time, won a series of scholarships, including the Phi Beta Kappa. At the end of his term as Bachelor of Economics, he was awarded a fellowship at Columbia University. More about that later in a minute. No story about our brother would be complete about a wonderful, an extraordinary gal, a blithe spirit called Ruth Faye West Cooper, as she became. I met Ruth Cooper for the first time on shore leave in the Navy. I'd just come back from the Pacific, and they had arranged for their wedding ceremony to be delayed until I got back. I was to be the best man, of course, at the wedding. And of course, what else could be more natural after the wedding? We all went on the same honeymoon together. How could anybody not love Ruth Cooper? When she died, Bill said, I'd never seen him sad all the years of our growing up. He said, I'm lost. I miss her. I don't know what the hell I'm going to do without her. But he recovered, and he felt her guiding spirit with him all the time. So where they are now is in a better place. I mean, better place than Austin, I mean. He was a difficult guy to live with, as Emily and I can testify. And Ruth would tell me, he said, you know about your brother? I said, yes, I know. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, divorce, no, murder, yes. Now, I want you all to know, Bob mentioned the great work that Linda, Susie, and Nan have done to honor the memory of the greatest guy I've known. And his wonderful friends are our wonderful friends. I just want you to know how much Emily and I appreciate all that you have done to honor this memory of a very special guy.
As you can see, I'm the baby sister. I don't know Bill, who we called Wager, and the rough part of him. As the baby sister, he babysat me until he had to go out and work and help support the family. And all I remember of those years was his wonderful, caring, taking care of me and our brother. However, as I grew older, he had to go out and work, so I didn't get to see him until a little bit later. At any rate, the part I knew of him, I think of it when I've talked to all of you and all the mentoring that he did through the years. I think he started with my brother and myself. We were mentored by him. And I know that at the time that we were being mentored that I did not appreciate it. I was as stubborn as they were. And not only that, I didn't pay as much attention as I should have in all the years that he encouraged me to go forward with my life. When I look back on it now, I wish that I had listened to him more, and wished that I had thanked him more for all that he did for me. For years, he kept telling me what I had to do. I know when we were working in Washington, D.C. during World War II, before he started his teaching career and before I started college, we were walking down the street, and he said to me, as long as I am enjoying what I am doing, they're going to have to tie me down to bury me. And guess what? That's exactly what happened. He wanted me to go to Reed College, and I applied and was accepted at the University of Chicago. And he got very upset with me and said, "What are you doing there?" And I said, "That's where I want to go." At any rate, he said, "Okay, if you come here, you are not to come in any of my classes or I will shove you out." So I did not apply to any of his classes. At any rate, we went forward, and I remember when he was very critical. At least that's the way I felt, that he was very critical of everything I did. If I would write him a letter, he would send it back to me corrected. If I said anything, in fact, when I made out my application to go to the University of Chicago, he looked at the essay that I had written. He said, "Who wrote that for you?" He didn't believe that I could write that. But when I look back on it, and not only that, thank God he married the wonderful lady Ruth, because for years after all what I thought was criticism, when I look back on it now, it was his effort to help me to become the person that I am. But at any rate, thank heaven, after a while, all of a sudden he started saying to me, "Keep up the good work." I didn't know what kind of good work he was talking about, but I think it was because he talked to Ruth, and Ruth said to him, "Quit being so critical of your sister." But at any rate, I do not remember the hard, harsh man that my brother Lee remembers. I remember the wonderful, soft, and caring, wonderful big brother.
This was the very centerpiece behind his desk in his office. The picture of the Earth from outer space, and to the right of that is Neil Armstrong. So that was pretty impressive. And I remember Uncle Bill saying it looked like dust and ashes, the surface of the moon. And there was something that captivated me later in life. The other thing that I remember that summer of '69, the next week after the lunar landing was Uncle Bill's birthday. And again, we get all dressed up, and I said, "Uncle Bill, what are we going to do for your birthday?" And he said, "We're going to go down to Carnegie Mellon, and we're going to go see the Beatles, the Yellow Submarine." So I'm thinking, wow, this Uncle Bill's pretty cool. So we go down to Carnegie Mellon to see a special showing of the Yellow Submarine. We see the Yellow Submarine, and man, I'm thinking, wow, Aunt Ruth and Uncle Bill are pretty cool to take me to go see the movie, The Yellow Submarine. And then we go out to eat afterwards. So this is well past my bedtime. I'm pretty excited. Again, my parents are in Europe. So actually it turned out that the dinner discussion was not so much about the Beatles, but the references to Einstein that's in the Yellow Submarine. And it turned out that Einstein was his friend. And it was, again, pretty impressive to hear that okay, people, he was my Uncle Bill. I didn't know at the time everything. I was 13, had no clue, that he would end up being the famous man that he was. And Einstein was his friend. They'd call, they'd talk, they'd discuss theories and problems and that sort of thing. So I was asked to talk a little about Ruth Faye West Cooper as well as Uncle Bill, because When Ruth passed away, it was her wish that there wouldn't be a memorial. So now we're going to memorialize Ruth, because had there not been a Ruth, there wouldn't have been as much Bill, because she really was a driving force to his success. Because without Bill, there wouldn't have been a Ruth, and without a Ruth, there really wouldn't have been as much Bill. This poem was written by Ruth, and I imagine it was about Uncle Bill when he was away. He did travel a lot for what he did, and this is her poem. The stars will be your garden walk, the moon your throne, a flaming comet your diadem, if only you'll come home. A meteor will be your scepter, and the sun will light your way. Oh, the universe will be our kingdom if you'll come back tonight.
You know, I had the great opportunity to be chair of the Department of Management, and what I found out right away was that I had to walk down to Bill Cooper's office to see what he was doing. We talked about a lot of things, me being a Northwestern guy and he being University of Chicago guy. And I would say, well, I never to get down south too much, but if I did go south, I went down to hear a lecture at the University of Chicago. But you know, when I would walk down to his office, it was always apparent to me that we talked about two things. We talked about all of the problems that he was trying to solve through the quantification of those problems. We talked about all of the articles that had been accepted and those that had been rejected and those that were revised, to be revised and resubmitted. One of the great things about Professor Cooper, being a professor, is that he understood the definition of what a professor is. That is, you think hard, you work hard, you solve problems, and you look forward to the future. As director of the IC² Institute, the Institute has 200 plus scholars around the globe. And Bill came one day and said, and this is 15, 16 years ago, and he said, I think that we're going to have issues in the Middle East, given the interaction of petroleum and religion, and I want to start the research that will allow people to manage that in the future. We need to understand the operations of what's going on there. We need to understand the issues that will be present. The Institute funded a study called Challenges of the Muslim World that was funded 10, 15, 16 years ago. It was reviewed in the Austin American Statesman, and right now it is the ultimate book on how people think about issues. So one of the things that we all learn from Professor Cooper is this. Whatever we do, we must always think about how to define the world. And he loves to take problems and do them mathematically. I'm a statistician myself. He would say, well, so Bill, I got to walk down the hall here and see some other faculty members. Now, John, what would that look like in operations research if we could quantify that? But the most important thing is, if there is a model, and he would walk down to my office and say, or he would send to the Institute, here are the list of articles that I have done. Here are the books that I am working on. Because my job is to think, is to solve problems, and of course, he loved to create societies, and more importantly, he loved to pass that knowledge to other people. We certainly will miss him at lunch, whether it was in the old faculty lounge where we ate, or whether it was in this building. He was always there, and he was always there with a smile.
I arrived at Carnegie Tech. I don't I don't recognize Carnegie Mellon. That somehow came later, and it's a different place. I have my degree from Carnegie Tech, and I kind of stick with that. So I arrived at Carnegie Tech in 1958 and discovered a collection of faculty who wanted to change the world. It's sort of an unusual, strong statement to make, but I think that was their attitude. It was an unknown school. They had a vision of a business school that would be totally different than the business schools of that time. Quite a few faculty at that time were there because they refused to sign loyalty oaths. You know, probably most of you are not old enough to remember Joe McCarthy, but that was a time when he was riding high and universities had to get faculty to sign loyalty oaths that they weren't communist and prepared to overthrow the country. And there were faculty who just refused to sign that, not because they intended to overthrow the country, but they felt that was not the right thing to do, and they ended up at Carnegie. There were people there who didn't get their PhD thesis accepted for one reason or the other, and they were there, and of course Bill was one of them who had a bachelor's degree, and that was his terminal degree. As I understand it from Bill, he wrote a thesis at Columbia and they didn't like it, and so he just told them that that was it, and if they didn't like it, that's the way it is, and he left and went to Carnegie. I was working then as a PhD student with my advisor who had a rejected thesis, and I think it was on his mind, and he would discuss it with me that his thesis was rejected, and I would talk with my wife, Veronica, and ask her what she thought. Was this going to make my life easier, because he sympathized with people who struggled and had trouble getting a thesis accepted, or he's going to show me an example of somebody else who will have a rejected thesis. So we kind of debated that, but at some point, and I see that in what the family is telling me, I would hand Bill a chapter and he would rewrite it as letters got back to people in the family rewritten. So he would rewrite the chapter, and I would have to hand it to my wife and say, well, you're going to have to change the chapter, and you have to keep in mind that we didn't have word processing software at that time. You sat at a typewriter and had all sorts of funny things you would do to try to retype the chapter. But I kept consoling my wife and saying, if Bill rewrites the thing, how can he, at the end, reject it? It's more or less his work. We had Leo Hurwitz, who was a very famous economist, and he got the Nobel Prize. And Leo and Bill had sort of a funny, interesting debate. They each were trying to argue that that each one had the least significant credentials. So Bill would argue, which he had the BA from Chicago, and Leo argued that he had a law degree from pre-war Poland, and the law in Poland post-war had nothing to do with the pre-war law, so his degree was totally worthless, and he felt that Bill had probably gotten something out of his BA at Chicago. I think it ended up as a draw, but they both wanted to make the point that they really made great achievements in science, economics, operations research, in spite of the fact that they hadn't this sort of certificate that you get from the universities. He sensed that with the advent of computing, which had just started at Carnegie, we had a room probably half the size of this room here that the computer filled. It probably had less computing power than your iPhone, but that was a revolutionary thing. He co-authored a book on linear programming with, it was called Charnes, Cooper, and Henderson Treatise on Linear Programming. And I understand that one of the leading experts in the field, professor named Egon Balash, who's a professor at Carnegie, studied that book when he was in solitary confinement in prison in Romania. And he learned the trade, learned the theory, understood the practice from that book by sitting in solitary confinement. So it's something to think about in terms of another approach to graduate education. I don't think we'd want to pursue that. So if you look at the family history, the family tree of Bill Cooper from an academic point of view, it's enormous. You know, probably hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students who are carrying on the tradition of exploring new ideas and applying them to make the world better.
So as I was thinking about what I would say very briefly, I was actually thinking about Tom Brokaw's book, The Greatest Generation, in which he reflected on the individuals who served in World War II and the type of character, the strength of those individuals, and what they did for the nation. I think there's an analog certainly for business schools and maybe for the great research institutions also. And it was a period from about 1945 through 1960 that the stars lined up for some reason, and just great individuals came together. And we look back on them, and we're just mystified at all that they did. And my first contact with the Coopers actually wasn't through Bill, it was through Ruth. Because I also, my wife at the time was African American. And it was at a reception with George, the Kosmeskis had put on, where Ruth actually wanted to get engaged with us because they were very concerned that somehow we weren't being accepted into the community. To be quite honest with you, if we weren't, I didn't know it. But she felt it. And so we got to know the Coopers. We were invited out. I don't know how many evenings a week people had dinner with the Coopers, because we used to go out all the time in the evening with the Coopers for dinner also. A lot of our conversation initially really wasn't an academic. It was with issues where Bill would reflect back on the founding of what was called SUPA, the School of Urban and Public Affairs, is that right, at Carnegie. And the issues of being able to integrate African Americans, when SUPA was formed, it was really during turbulent times, and how interested and concerned they were about social justice. And in a sense, this was most of my initial meetings with the Coopers. But one of the unique aspects of Bill for me was always anything I could do that was kind of really out of the box. He always encouraged me to do it, even when I was being told not to do it. He wanted me to try it. And part of this, I think, goes back again to Carnegie and the issues of experimentation. One was to get involved with Monterey Tech, told go down and kill that deal. Another was the Consortium for Graduate Study and Management, which was an organization to engage underrepresented minorities. Told not to do it. And a third that I'll mention in a minute. I would talk with Bill about this, that I really thought they were good. He said, do them. If they, they'll never find out. And if they do, what are they going to do about it? It was that type. Most of them were really doing good things. They were really reaching out and doing good things. And one of his passions actually was IC Square. He believed in the IC Square because it was separate from the university at the time. He told me to use it as an excuse to go to George Kosmeski, to get George re-engaged in the campus. Go back and give him, say, this is a way, if we really make this go, and give George a reason to come back, because he wasn't back at the time. He was separate. He had his own building and so forth. And I went over to George and said, we have a problem. but I think it's a real opportunity. We can turn a problem into opportunity. George's comment to me was, why are you here? Do you need money? It was, we want to get you re-engaged back. George was a fan and a supporter of the IC Square, and I actually believe it was because he thought it had some of the attributes of a Carnegie, which was very, very important to him. I received a call, actually, from the president at that time of Carnegie, a good friend of Al Bloomstein's, I might add, who's going to be speaking next, saying that I had been nominated to be the dean of the business school at Carnegie, and they just wanted to come and talk with me. When I was interviewed, I was actually interviewed by Herb Simon. It turns out that Bill Cooper wanted me to go to Carnegie. It was Bill that did it, and it was Herb Simon that actually recruited me. And he became also a very, very dear and close friend of mine, very, very big supporter. And that, in a sense, going to Carnegie was a baptism for me, because I could do things that I always wanted to do, always aspired to do. This was the world that I could do them in.
About 45 years ago, I was working in Washington and had a call from Bill Cooper. And he just wanted to come down and meet. We had never met. I knew much about him because I had seen the impressive events that had happened at GSIA that you've heard a lot about. And it was clear he was a major piece of that action. Also, my graduate work was in operations research, and his work in linear programming was a major feature and a major accomplishment in operations research. So I was delighted to have an opportunity to meet with him. I didn't know what he had in mind, but I was delighted to have that happen. Turns out that in Pittsburgh, there was a major individual named Richard King Mellon, who was the leader of clearing the skies of Pittsburgh from the enormous soot that had taken it over in the 30s and 40s and got cleared up by the 50s. Richard King Mellon, in the 60s, came to realize that he knew how to get rid of soot, but he didn't know how to deal with the social problems that were bedeviling the nation during the 1960s, and he figured the solution would be to create an academic entity that would work at doing that. Turned out that he then created the School of Urban and Public Affairs at Carnegie Mellon, because Carnegie Mellon had just transitioned from Carnegie Tech to Carnegie Mellon, and Richard King Mellon was part of the Mellon family and part of that transition. They did a national search to find the best person to lead that effort, and that, of course, was Bill Cooper. He was the first dean of the college. It was of the school. It was created as a separate graduate school, and as Jerry Cohen indicated, to train men and women of intelligent action. This was the principle that had guided Bill Cooper's professional career through that time. Bill was his usual pugilistic self as dean in many of his interactions with faculty, usually his pugilistic self in protecting students of his from those who wanted to challenge him, who wanted to challenge the students. He was at the same time an impressively gracious host when he hosted the faculty. He and Ruth had a farm, and it became clear that Ruth was an absolutely charming woman until you saw her in her legal battle, where Ruth had picked up some of those pugilistic skills from her husband. That they were an impressive couple that everyone just came to appreciate and adore during their time. It was clear that he built a faculty that was going to be challenging just as he had contributed to building a faculty at GSIA in the business school that was going to challenge conventional wisdom in how you do business. He was going to build a faculty that's going to challenge conventional wisdom in how you develop public policy.
I spent in my first year of the PhD program, being a research assistant, working actually on data envelopment analysis applications. This focus on real problems, problem-driven research, and developing methods that are relevant to the solution of real problems was a key focus of what Bill imparted to me, which is not just sort of solving real problems with off-the-shelf methods, but actually developing new methods to solve real problems. And that I think I've internalized in my interactions with Bill. I went on to work with several other faculty members who are here. IC Squared was an important part of my time here as well. I was an IC Squared fellow and worked with several faculty who had connections back to Carnegie Mellon. So this point that Bob mentioned about the links between Texas and Carnegie Mellon are quite instructive. In '87, when I completed my PhD, I went back to Bill. I had offers from many business schools, and the only offer that was not from a business school was from Carnegie Mellon. It was from SUPA, and actually Al was the dean who hired me. And I went back to Bill and I said, this is the offer set, and he sort of didn't even give it much thought. He said, you should absolutely go to Carnegie Mellon. He knew me well, and I think I've been there 24 years now, and it's been a blast. In '98, I was awarded the William W. Cooper and Ruth F. Cooper Professorship. I became the Cooper Professor of Information Systems. And Bill came up and Ruth. That was when I actually met Ruth Cooper as well. They both came up to this event that was held when I was awarded this professorship. One of the things you do as part of stewardship when you receive an endowed chair is you write the person in whose honor this chair is endowed, and you tell them how you're able to do all sorts of great things because of this chair and all the things that it affords. So I wrote a letter like that, and Bill wrote back and he said, let's cut to the chase. I don't want to listen to all of this stuff. Send me your research papers. So then that began a process of my sending him research papers, and like Emily mentioned, he would mark it up like he did my first year when I was working up with him, and he would say, why are you proving the theorem this way? Or it was just like being back in grad school. And so every year I would send him a paper, and I had to pick the paper I thought was my best paper and send it to him, and sure enough, it'll come marked up.
This is a toast to Bill and, of course, to his indispensable partner, Ruth, as he called her. And these three people generously were going to do open mic, but we've decided to go ahead and move to the toast and a song. And they will talk with the family and others after the toast, and we invite you to stay around and please mingle and share your stories about Bill as we close, because I know some people have to travel and some people have very early mornings tomorrow morning. And we're going to close with a wonderful song. But first, a toast to Bill and Ruth Cooper. One of the things, please stand. One of the things that Bill always said to my students, including my son, he said, be prepared to take your opportunities. So I leave you with that thought. Bill lives on. To Bill and Ruth. Here, here, to Bill and Ruth. Salute.